department at Smith College. He has taught courses on 20th century poetry, American literature, and American studies. His primary research interest is poetry. Michael's first experience of Wales involved hiking in the northwest, where he first heard Welsh spoken and where very friendly folks in village pubs bought rounds of Felin Boyle, which he was taught to call feeling foul, as well as 2 days in the company of the poet Gillian Clarke. Both of these instilled in him a love for the country and its literature. Since that trip, he has invited Welsh and Anglo-Welsh poets to read at Smith College, where he teaches, and he has written and published on the work of R.S. Thomas and David Jones, as well as Gillian Clarke. He can't wait to get back to Ceredigion and to Snowdonia, where he looks forward to travelling with his spouse Emily next year. Mr. Thurston will present Gillian Clarke, National Poet of Wales, 2008 to 2016. Welcome, Michael.
I don't know if I should even touch this arrangement. Can you hear me if I just stand here like this and bellow as I have been taught to do in a 30-year teaching career? I often think that my job is assuming that you don't like poetry and helping you to understand that you actually do. And so that will be what I try to do with the help of Gillian Clarke, who is a wonderful poet and whose poetry, in what is effectively glorified show and tell, I'm going to walk through a little bit today. As Sue mentioned, one of the great treats that I had on my first visit to Wales in the mid-1990s was a couple days in Gillian's company. I was working on some essays on poets. I had come across Gillian's poetry in the context of that of other poets, chiefly R.S. Thomas, but then a next generation of poets, Oliver Reynolds and Tony Conran and many others. And Gillian's work really stood out to me. And it stood out in part because it resonated with work that I was also doing on the nature of Welsh nationalism. And Welsh political nationalism as an internationalist nationalism, if that makes sense, as a sort of paradox, as a cosmopolitan nationalism, which might be a better and more precise way to talk about it. If you're familiar with the platform of Plaid Cymru over the last 50 years, the ideal of an independent Welsh nation is connected to the capacity of the Welsh as a nation to enter the community of nations through structures like the European Union and others. This was the ideal and rhetoric that was behind the 1979 St. David's Day referendum. It was behind the eventual successful partial devolution that has given rise to the position of First Minister from whom we were to hear greetings. And I like to think that seeing him move his lips while we were hearing music was probably the ideal, as opposed to the political commentary. Gillian Clarke has been a central figure in contemporary Welsh poetry. In the 1970s and 80s, she was the editor of the Anglo-Welsh Review. This is now a magazine called the New Welsh Review. She was the president of a writers' centre in North Wales, which she co-founded in 1990. She has been a tutor in creative writing at the University of Glamorgan since 1994. She's since retired. She's in her 80s and has settled happily on her farm in Ceredigion. She has been a judge for the Poetry Society's Ted Hughes Award in Poetry, and she served for some time as the National Poet of Wales. And when she was named to that position, Di Smith, who was the chair of the Arts Council of Wales, said, and here's a quote, "Gillian Clarke has honed her considerable artistic practice to create, over the years, a body of poetry which deals with the inner essentials of universal human needs and the outer specifics of a distinctive Wales, her take on Wales, which cradles them. Although her poetry," and now I'm not quoting any longer, this is me, "although her poetry is often anchored in the Welsh rural landscape, it is never insular. It looks beyond the regional to the wider world." We see this in a number of poems where Gillian is thinking about sheep on her farm and a difficult delivery of twin sheep as she's listening to news of the negotiation for the Good Friday Peace Accords in Ireland. As she is thinking about the movement of radioactive clouds after the Chernobyl event west so that cesium falls in rain and puddles on the landscape and is sipped by Welsh sheep, right? So that the national and the international are always woven together for Clarke. And when she thinks about nationalism and national identity, as she does in two really wonderful poetic sequences that I'm going to say a bit about, but that aren't on the handout that I gave you because they're really difficult to excerpt. The parts are really tightly interwoven and difficult to separate. But in one, called The King of Britain's Daughter, she uses the Mabinogian's tale of the giant Bendigeidfran and his daughter Bronwyn as means of thinking about her own relationship to her father, who died when she was a child. Her father was a mariner who died at sea. And through that, the relationship that she has with the Welsh landscape on which she interacted with her father. I'll read you a couple passages in a minute. But all of this is a way of thinking about the relationship of Wales, Welsh lineage, Welsh ancestry, Welsh legend as it comes to her through the Mabinogion, and the broader European and then global context in which all these things might signify and might take on an interesting sort of complicated significance. One of the things that I want to suggest is that when Gillian Clarke is thinking about Welshness, she's and is locating that on the literal ground of Wales, she's also thinking about all the processes that erode grounds, whether literal or metaphorical, and in those acts of erosion really complicate any notion of identity or ancestry, national or cultural. And we were talking a lot at our table about genealogical and ancestral research. And I'll say something about Clarke's own genealogical and ancestral research in a minute when I talk about a sequence that she published in the 1980s called Coviant. But I wanted to read you just a bit from King of Britain's Daughter, where she's thinking about her father, who was a radio engineer on ships. And she's thinking about the figures of the giant, Bendigeidfran, and she's thinking about the sister, Branwen, who is in Ireland and who runs into the trouble that she runs into in Ireland, to perform these culturally distinctive Welsh dramas, but to do so in a way that is also linking them to everything that exceeds and in some ways supersedes the nation. So I'm just going to read you a couple of passages that aren't on the handout so you get a sense of what that looks and sounds like. Seal's head in water, Bran's footprint in a slab of rock deep enough for a child to swim, an S of light as far as Ireland. Salt in my mouth and the wind to lean on, the boom and suck in the cave where the boat rowed us into the dark for us to shout. This is a memory of being at the seaside with her father, and thinking of her father, who is a giant to her as a child, and as a giant then resonates with the giant figure from Welsh myth and legend. And as they're looking at the sea and at seals, and they're looking west to Ireland, thinking about the Mabinogion legend, right? All of these things are intertwined together. And then later in the poem, when the world wobbled, we heard it on a radio chained by its fraying plait of wires to the kitchen windowsill, between a sheaf of letters, bills and things needing to be done, and a jar of marigolds. And over its bakelite crown, the sea, level as milk, the news came out of the sky, a mist off the sea, an incoming shadow of rain or wings. And if you remember the legend in the Mabinogion, Branwen, when she's in the court of the Irish king, and as a punishment for the souring relationship between the Welsh king and the Irish king, she's sent to serve as a scullery maid. She trains a starling to speak, and she releases the starling, and it flies back to tell her brother of the indignity that she's suffering in Ireland. And so you have here the images of birds and the image of communication going through the sky and through the mist to communicate across the boundaries between kingdoms. And this is something that takes on a totally modern sense in the image of a radio perched in its bakelite shell on the windowsill, and these references to birds, so that the old and the legendary, the mythic, the national are intertwined with the contemporary, the individual, but also the global, because radio signals travel beyond national borders with absolute ease. Right, so for Gillian Clarke, Welshness and Welsh nationalism is always in the context of and always related to and always in some ways subverted by, even as it tries to assert itself against, internationalism, cosmopolitan citizenship, the world as a place in which we live, as well as the nation as a place in which we live. And we see this dynamic especially powerful in another poem that I didn't give you that I'm going to tell you about. And this is her really brilliant poetic sequence, Cofiant. So many of you, I think, have traveled in Wales. Many of you who have done so have probably walked through Welsh cemeteries, and if you've done that, you've seen the inscription Ercov an, right, in memory of, on Welsh tombstones. And the Cofiant, which comes from that same root, right, memory, is a distinctively Welsh genre of commemorative publication, usually for a local minister. And so there would often be a genealogy. So you find these books. If you go to antiquarian bookstores in Wales, you will come across copies of these Cofiants. Tributes from local people, often a poetic elegy. There sometimes is a genealogy that's part of this. And so this is something that links a local figure, typically a nonconformist minister, right, the minister at the chapel, to this broader Welsh history. And Clarke decides to do a sort of Cofiant for herself as a means of doing some genealogical research into her family. And so many of the individual poems in the sequence are about members of her family, traces of whom she's discovered through these genealogical researches. But she also is confronting the fact that what you run into is traces. And when what you find is a trace, what that means is that the thing you find a trace of is no longer present but is absent. The trace is always an indication of the absence of something that is no longer there. And this is the case with her father. She finds letters from her father, but they're written in an ink that fades. Quink, I don't know if any of you ever have written with a fountain pen with quink. It's cheap ink that doesn't last. And so there's a sense of the disappearance of the traces linked with the disappearance of the father. So who she's remembering, but also confronting the fact that she forgets. And time after time after time, as she discovers another relative further and further and further back in time, what we encounter is the absence or the trace that shows their disappearance as much as we see their appearance. So in a section on her father, she marvels at the fact that he's in fading photographs and he's in washable, disappearing ink. When she goes a little farther back, she gets to relatives whose only traces are gravestone inscriptions that are beginning to erode so that they're no longer legible. And she talks often about the thing that's not there, the house that is no longer there, the person that's no longer there, the farm that's no longer there because it was sold and it's not even a farm anymore, and those sorts of things. And she does this all the way back. And this is a way of thinking about the relationship between an identity that she wants to claim and the dissolution of that identity into things that are broader, whether that is time and loss and grief, which is something that is universally experienced, or whether that is the other communities with which we're connected by forces like the sea or the wind, which are erosive or corrosive on the one hand, but are also the things that bind us into communities that are broader than the national community on the other hand. So, so much for the Gillian Clarke poems that I'm not going to show you or talk about. But I want to say a little about some of the ones that I gave you on a handout, and I thought, well, I should say one more that I feel, I wasn't going to talk about this one, but then I was thinking about the occasion, and it's a poem that I think is, it's not her best, and so it was not one that I was really intent on sharing with you. But when I thought about the occasion, I thought we should maybe at least talk a little bit about it. So this is a fairly early poem. This is from one of her early books called Letter from a Far Country. And the title is Miracle on St. David's Day, right? So hence the reason for including it. And in it, she talks about going to a nursing home and giving a poetry reading at a nursing home. And an older man who is there and who is silent, who hasn't spoken in decades, at a certain point in the poetry reading stands up and recites a poem. And the poem that he recites is William Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And as you'll recall, the key image in that poem is daffodils. Daffodils waving in their multitudes beside the seaside. He is suddenly standing, silently, huge and mild, but I feel afraid. Like slow movement of spring water on the first bird of the year in the breaking darkness, The laborer's voice recites the daffodils. The nurses are frozen, alert. The patients seem to listen. He is hoarse, but word perfect. Outside, the daffodils are still as wax, 1,000, 10,000, their syllables unspoken, their creams and yellows still. 40 years ago, in a Valleys school, the class recited poetry by rote. Since the dumbness of misery fell, he has remembered there was a music of speech, and that once he had something to say. When he's done, before the applause, we observe the flowers' silence. A thrush sings, and the daffodils are flame. Now, this, I think, is a really interesting moment where Clarke is confronting a heritage that is, on the one hand, deplorable, and is, on the other hand, enabling, and as the poem's title suggests, miraculous. That a child in a Valleys school memorized a Wordsworth poem is testimony to the imposition of English as language, as literature, as culture, so the colonizing influence on this country, which was part of an intentional extirpation of Welsh language and literature and culture. On the other hand, Wordsworth's meditation on the daffodil, and this is the same Wordsworth who writes the wonderful poem about Tintern Abbey, right? So this is a Wordsworth for whom Welsh landscapes mattered, shows in this interesting way the inherence of the Welsh landscape and tradition in what becomes the English romantic poetic tradition, so that what's being imposed on the Welsh is in fact something that came in some ways from the Welsh. And Clarke is signaling that really interesting circularity of the relationship between these cultures, so that the colonized and the colonizer have some things in common, and what they have in common is a flower whose name comes from the name of the saint who we're celebrating today, right? David, the daffodil. And I'm not saying anything to you who know this fully well. The daffodil is the thing that we're all wearing and sharing today because of the derivation of its name from the name of St. David. So now to the things that I did bring for you to look at, and I'm mindful of time and I don't want to overstay my time, and I know we've got both an annual meeting and another really wonderful looking presentation to get to. So I'm not going to talk about everything that's on the handout, but I wanted to talk through one in particular and gesture maybe with some more brevity to a couple of the others. The first one that you see on the handout is At Ystrad Fleur. And this is a poem that is inspired by the burial place of the wonderful, sort of ancient Welsh poet, David ap Gwilym. This is a poet many point to as the beginning of the identifiable Welsh literary tradition. And at this place, as Clarke is looking at the landscape, she's looking at the landscape through the understanding that it's a landscape that has inspired poets for centuries and generations before herself. And so there is this deep continuity that she's exploring between herself and that linguistic and literary tradition through the landscape that inspired that tradition. And I'm not going to read the whole poem, but the moment that I love is the moment about the 6th stanza. The Tavy is in full flood and rich with metals, a torque in a brown pool gleaming for centuries, so that the river and its sediments are linked to an image for kingship that is a particularly Celtic kingship, which means it is a symbol for the Welsh kingship in this place, rather than for the English kingship that will become imposed upon it by the final defeat of the Welsh by Edward I in whatever century that was, 13th century. I am spellbound in a place of spells. She's noting both the magical character of the place and the fact that poetry is at its root magic. The cant in incantation is a word for song. It's the cognate with the word chant. The chant that we find in religious spaces. The singing that turns a real world space into a sacred space. That sort of spellboundness and spell character of poetry is what she's getting at here. I am spellbound in a place of spells, cloud changes gold to stone as their circled bones dissolve in risen corn. This is a place where I'm going to get really nerdily English professory on you for about 45 seconds, and so just bear with me. There was a wonderful theorist of literature, a guy named Northrop Frye, in the middle of the 20th century, who said that the essence of poetic language really is two things. That what you have that distinguishes poetic language from everyday language is, on the one hand, what he calls babble. That is the sound play of rhyme and rhythm and assonance and alliteration and things like that. And on the other is what he calls doodle or riddle. And that is the way that in poetic language we think about one thing in terms of another. And this really is metaphor for the most part. And in this stanza, we see Clarke exploiting both. The river races for the south, too full of summer rain. I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. I am spellbound in a place of spells. Cloud changes gold to stone. Right? The image here is a cloud coming over so that the gold of the sunshine turns into the gray of stone. This is a consequence of a climatic or weather change. As their circled bones dissolve in risen corn, the metamorphosis in which the buried body feeds the earth that then gives rise to the next harvest that feeds the next generation. So this is Clarke learning from David ap Gwilym and the Welsh literary tradition, particular patterns of sonic repetition and particular means of metaphor, thinking about one thing in terms of another, to perform the magic spell that is the poem in a place that is spellbound. It is held in the spells of the poet, David ap Gwilym, who is buried in this place. If that doesn't do my job for me and tell you how cool poems can be, then there's not another poet that can do that job. And so Clarke is somebody for whom this whole combination of Welsh land, Welsh language, Welsh literary history, Welsh national history, Welsh mythology, they matter deeply. Even as she is somebody with an English-sounding surname, it's her married name, her born name was Williams, and somebody who was not a Welsh speaker as a child, had to learn Welsh as an adult as she became more interested in it, and somebody who is deeply interested in a Welsh nationalism that is a cosmopolitan nationalism, very much like what the Plaid Cymru had advocated, and continues to advocate even after the, I don't want to get too political, the disaster that was Brexit. The last poem that I want to say something about, Clear that I gave you is a really interesting one. This is a Welsh poet thinking about Shakespeare and about the inherent Welshness in Shakespeare. Here again, this kind of picks up interestingly a conversation that we had at our table about the experience of particular ancestral migrants that then shows up in literary representation in the plays of Shakespeare. Here, Clarke is thinking about King Lear. Lear is a name that comes from the Welsh, so the King of Britain is understood as a Welsh king, first and foremost, who is connected to particular places in Wales, so that Clarke is thinking about the Welsh that is kind of inherent there in what we think of as the English literary tradition, for whom there is no greater figure than Shakespeare. But the poem that I want to talk about, and it's the last one that I'm going to drag you through, I promise, is Fires on Flynn, which begins on the next page, sort of across, down at the bottom on the right-hand side. And here, again, she's on a landscape. She is in R.S. Thomas's old parish. R.S. Thomas, a wonderful Welsh poet from the middle of the 20th century, was a minister in the Church of Wales, so the Anglican church that is in Wales. And she's walking in Thomas's footsteps, and she's looking at this landscape, and she's walking in the company of a friend. And there are a few things that happen here that do this kind of linkage that I'm suggesting Clarke is really interested in doing. So in connecting to Thomas, she's connecting to one of the nearest and most powerful poetic ancestors for her. And in walking on the Flynn Peninsula, she's connecting to a place that is known for kind of the deep Welshness of its own culture. I'm going to read a lot of the poem, in part because I want to just have it in your head as I go back to talk about some of it. So I'm in the third stanza on the second page of the poem. 3 English boys throw stones. Chuffs sound alarm. Seabirds rise and 20,000 saints finger the shingle to the sea's intonation. Facing west, we've talked for hours of our history, thinking of Ireland and the hurt cities, gunshot on lonely farms, praised unsectarian saints, entry open to the broken rosary of their coracles, praying in Latin and Welsh. Done with cliff talking, we turn inland, thinking of home silently filling with shadows, the hearth quiet for the struck match, our bed spread with clean sheets. Our eyes are tired with sun gazing. Suddenly we shout, the farms burn. Through binoculars we see distant windows curtained with flame. The fires are real the minute while we gasp, begin to run. Then realize windows catch not fire, but the setting sun. We are struck still without a word in any language. See the hairs run, windows darken, hear the sea's mumbled novenas. That is just, I should stop there because to say anything is in some way to diminish the impact of what you just heard. In the figure of the English voice throwing stones, Clarke is nodding to contemporary controversies. So you've got English tourists coming to the Llyn Peninsula and throwing stones at the native birds. This is this kind of low-grade violence that's being done by representatives of the once colonizing power that is still colonizing in a different way by buying up holiday homes, pricing the locals out of the market. This is something that was a phenomenon that precipitated a lot of property destruction in especially the 1980s. And you've got Clarke at the same time as they're looking out at the sea and looking beyond the sea to the west, to Ireland, thinking about the migration of saints, the settlement of religion, the relationship of Welsh to Latin, Irish to Latin, these Celtic languages to Latin, the linguistic richness that the sound patterns in the poem tries to play with, and these beautiful repetitions of sound that you have from time to time. Seabirds rise and 20,000 saints finger the shingle to the sea's intonation, right? I'm not going to claim that this is anything like the really brilliant, intricate, ancient Welsh poetic forms of Cynganedd, but it is something that she's got kind of as an echo in the background. Clarke is that telling me my time is up? Clarke then kind of cranks up the volume on the political violence when we shift from stone throwing to gunshot. And so looking across the Irish Sea and thinking about Ireland is to think about sectarian violence. The reason why she and her companion praise non-sectarian saints is that there's something to be preferred there against the sectarian violence that we're familiar with from Ireland. And when they turn away and they're heading toward home, this has been a long day of hiking, they're looking forward to getting back to home and to bed, and they see these fires. This is a reference to the burning of English-owned holiday homes in Welsh coastal locations in the 1980s by Welsh nationalists. And the alarm that's what we're seeing. We're seeing fires. Because the political context is one in which, of course, if we see something that looks like flame, there must be fire. And only after the sort of pause and step back, realizing that what they're seeing is the setting sun on the window. And so we end instead with the return of nature, a nature that, just as in at Ystrad strikes them still without a word, spellbound in this place of spells, right? Without a word in any language, whether English or Welsh or Latin or anything else, because in some way the natural imagery exceeds our capacity to utter it, whatever the language is in which we try to utter it, and we're left with the hairs running, the windows darkening, and an image that concludes poem after poem after poem for Clarke, an image of that which washes away the traces that we leave on the beach, that which washes away sometimes the buildings that we build on cliffs, but that which also connects us through the roots of trade and mercantilism and communication, the sea. The sea which dissolves, but also holds us all together. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope that this has given you a little bit of a sense of what Clarke does, why I think she's wonderful, and why she's well worth reading, even if you don't think you like poems. Because if you're going to like any poems, Clarke's might be the ones that you end up liking. Thank you. And Sue, I'm going to look to you. I don't know if there's time for questions or if we should just move right on.
Anyone have any questions? I have so many. I can't put them all to my voice, but you teach at Smith?
I do.
And what are the classes that you teach?
Currently, for my sins, I'm in an administrative position and not teaching, but that's only for another 17 weeks. So I teach courses on 20th century British and American poetry. I teach courses on the American literary tradition, the British literary tradition, things like that.
Well, thank you very much for being here today and sharing. I have no idea. I have never read Gillian Clarke, but I intend to, and I totally support her position on naturalism.
It's really wonderful stuff. Her collected poems, still in print by Carcanet. You can get it on Amazon. Also, feel free to be in touch if you have questions after this. I know sometimes it's hard to think of the question now, but my email address is easy to find on the Smith College website.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you again. We will now proceed with our short and sweet annual meeting. All